A reading from the book of Genesis. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that all the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
All summer long, we've been following the Genesis narrative about the lives of the patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel. We started with Abraham and Sarah, continued with Isaac and Rebekah, followed the stories of Esau and Jacob, and then Jacob and his 4 wives, Leah and Rachel, and their handmaids, their slaves, Bilhah and Zilpah, who, by the way, were the inspiration for the dystopian novel by Margaret Atwood and the new Hulu TV series called The Handmaid's Tale. Just saying. Public service announcement. We come now to the story of Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, whose brothers sold him into slavery. When we get to this story, he has risen in favor with the Pharaoh, and he is in a position to save his family from great famine. That he does that, and how he does that, are both important as we consider our own lives today. If there's one thing we've learned about human nature in this whole study, it's that we are all complex creatures. The good and the bad in us all makes it hard to erect statues to any of us, don't you know? The same history can be read in more than one way, to advantage or disadvantage some, which is why we even have to read the Bible carefully. Now, I'll tip my hand here. We read it best when we read it looking for God and for good. First, let's be honest about Joseph. It's easy for us to gloss over his character and see him as the one virtuous soul in this long saga, the one unblemished hero we can all hold on to and emulate. We love Joseph and his technicolor coat, right? We feel for him being betrayed by his brothers. But if you read closely, you can see that Joseph isn't the innocent angel we always make him out to be. Yes, he was his father's favorite. He also seemed to enjoy the role. He didn't sympathize with his brothers. He was actually a tattletale, right? Who likes a tattletale, which is why the brothers don't just have a problem with father, they have a problem with their brother Joseph too. And when the brothers come to him in Egypt, Joseph, who now has an Egyptian name and an Egyptian wife and children that are Egyptian by her, which is why they don't recognize him, right? When he finally reveals himself to them and forgives them, he doesn't do it right away. He toys with them. He manipulates them. He turns the tables of power on them, gives them a little bit of their own medicine, right? So before the snippet of this text that we just read, Joseph has already sent the brothers back once to their father and demanded that the other son, Benjamin, be sent back to him. And this son, Benjamin, is his actual full brother by the same mother, Rachel. And in making sure that happens, he holds hostage one of his brothers, Simeon, to make sure they come back to him with Benjamin. Well, they go to Jacob, and Jacob, in the meantime, you understand, has transferred his favorite son loyalties from Joseph, whom he thinks is dead, to Benjamin, right? And he does not want to give up another son and lose another favorite son, so he balks. But when the food runs out again, he relents. When Benjamin arrives in Egypt, then, Joseph sets him up. He has his servants put a silver chalice into his sack of grain and then accuses him of trying to steal from him. Well, then when Judah, another brother, is afraid that Jacob will lose Benjamin too, so he substitutes himself in his place, and all of this, as the tension rises in this narrative, just when it gets to fever pitch, finally, Joseph reveals himself, has a good cry, and sets things right. So, what we see here is that Joseph is a chip off the old block. He does the right thing eventually, but not before exacting his pound of flesh. This isn't the virtuous behavior we want to be our model of biblical character, right? And yet, God uses this family with all of its flawed figures to accomplish God's purposes for good and move the story of redemption forward. God wasn't waiting for the perfect person to arise before doing some good, which should give us all some comfort, right? We don't have to wait for a virtuous president or parent or pastor before hoping that God will do something good. We've been hearing arguments all week about statues of Confederate generals in Charlottesville and all over the country, including Dallas. Their very presence in public places continues to cause division and pain among us. Some say these men were all bad because they fought to preserve the institution of slavery. And make no mistake, that was the cause. Others want to whitewash the fact that they fought against the United States and for the right to own other human beings. They only want to emphasize what otherwise honorable men they were. Do you see what we do with our figures of the past? It's impossible to assess them perfectly. And so we all have an interest in one version of their lives or another. Some, including our president, think that if Robert E. Lee is censured, then what about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and even Abraham Lincoln? The former two were slaveholders themselves, and Lincoln started out with many of the same attitudes about the inferiority of blacks and the superiority of whites and the institution of slavery that Southerners held. Here's the thing. The Founding Fathers laid the groundwork for the future liberation of all, even if they didn't live up to it entirely themselves in their day. We see in Lincoln, though especially, a change of heart that is Joseph-like in his progress. We see his mind change to the point where he has a disgust for slavery, and he uses his power for the emancipation of slaves. We do not see that in those who fought to preserve white supremacy and a system of systemic racism. These statues need to come down not to deny history, but to acknowledge that the reason they were put there in the first place was not a fair rendering of history itself. If that were the case, we would also have statues of former slaves and of abolitionists side by side. But where are the Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman statues, right? These statues were erected either during times in the last century that coincided first with the birth of the KKK or during the Civil Rights era, when white Americans were anxious about what would become of them if black Americans received the full measure of their citizenship. They were deliberate reminders to black Americans about who is still in charge. That is not what we want to say to one another today. We need to think more about who we want to be than who we were. And these men are not our models. They keep the wound of racial injustice open, and they hurt white Americans as well as people of color. David Brooks wrote this week about the growing anxiety and extremism in our country and proposed a different approach. Here's what he said. The most powerful answer to fanaticism is modesty. Modesty means having the courage to understand that the world is too complicated to fit into one political belief system. It means understanding that there are no easy answers or malevolent conspiracies that can explain the big political questions or the existential problems. Modesty means having the courage to rest in anxiety and not try to quickly escape it. Uncertainty and anxiety throw you off the smug island of certainty and force you into the free waters of creativity and learning. What we see in Joseph is creativity in motion. He is learning and becoming. He is leaning into the good. And how he does that is also instructive. Here's what he says in the text. It was not you who sent me here, but God. And when I hear that, I don't know about you, when I hear that, something in me wants to say, please don't say that. I mean, are you trying to say that God inspired your brothers to send you into slavery? As a pastor, I just want to say, no, I've heard too many people say things like, everything happens for a reason. Really? You know, is that what you want to say? Christians sometimes say these things without thinking or thinking deeply. It leads people to defend abuse against others as if it's ordained by God. It leads people to attribute hurricanes and epidemics to God's vengeance. In the wrong hands, God becomes the author of evil, and people who are victimized by all of this are just told to be patient and wait until they can see that what looks like it's bad that has happened to them is really good. No! To protect the sovereignty of God, some Christians read words like these of Joseph and posit a doctrine of predestination. You know what that means? That is to say, God decides everything ahead of time that's going to happen. God is the active agent in the world that brings everything to be. Like the pious little Calvinist lady who fell down the stairs one day. She got up and dusted herself off and said, "Phew, praise God, that's over." as if it were foreordained that she had to fall down the stairs. This is nonsense. Look at what Joseph is really saying. He doesn't let his brothers off the hook. He says, you sold me into slavery. But he doesn't want to keep the cycle of violence and retribution, vengeance going. He looks for God and for good in the present moment. He isn't trying to come up with some grand rationale for evil. He is referring all things to God as a way of preventing himself from taking matters into his own hands. And this gives his brothers a chance to recover. Joseph doesn't lecture his brothers on how they should accept famine now as the will of God. He doesn't suggest he knows God's ways for others. He is sending all of his anxieties and uncertainties up to God in order that he not act in haste with hate toward his brothers. You see? This is so important. Joseph attributes his circumstances to God as a way of making a different future. He believes God is always on the side of good. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Evil happens. God is not the author of evil, but God is not thwarted by it either. God is at work in all things to bring good. So when St. Paul says in Romans that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose, he is not saying that all things are good. He is saying that God is at work in all things to bring good. I would call this the doctrine of predestination. That is, when we look at the present with a view to the end that we believe is going to be good because God is at work, then we are claiming that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The moral philosopher Iris Murdoch called this the sovereignty of the good. God and good are the same thing. If we say we're committed to God, then we better be committed to good, to do what is good, to act in whatever circumstances we find ourselves for the good, and that good will always be a story of redemption, not retribution. Which leads me to say that we read the Bible wrongly when we think God authorizes governments to nuke other human beings when those governments believe that it's called for, and that the commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves only applies to Christians loving one another within the church. This is an atrocious principle of biblical interpretation. Because what it does is it sees one moral imperative for the church and another for the rest of the world. God has one standard of goodness, people. And the church's call is to call the world to live up to that standard of goodness. Not to support the world standard of rushing to war and violence, which always ends up sacrificing innocence along with the guilty for some higher purpose. Who can hear the good news of Jesus Christ when the church is making claims like this? Really? If we are acting in service to God and good, here is a test. It will be good not only for us and our kin, our brothers and sisters, people who are like-minded or who look like us. It will be good for our neighbor and even for our enemy. It doesn't matter if you are white or black or other color. American or North Korean, Christian, Jew or Muslim, poor or rich, gay or straight, Native American, recent immigrant, or long ago immigrant. Joseph's brothers sacrificed him for their own good, but he would not sacrifice them for his own good. He stood in solidarity with them. He used his power on behalf of the vulnerable. He refused to play the victim card. He saw that his having power at all had a purpose bigger than his own interest. The church's responsibility in every age is to proclaim good news to the captives, freedom to the slaves, the marginalized, the hurting. And it is to our everlasting shame that we have sometimes defended our privilege by denying it to other people. In the same way, I tell you, our country's only hope is not found in taking it back from black Americans or immigrants as if we white Americans have some eternal purchase on power. Our hope is found in the Joseph way, and that is in using our power for the good of all. Only those who do that, I tell you, are worthy of a public pedestal in this life or the next. Amen.